Hey, U.S. history students, this is Mr. Baker again. This is Baker's Corner. Hope you are doing well. We actually are going to finish up our study of World War I today by looking at the process of the treaty and why it was defeated by the U.S. Senate here. So let's go ahead and get started where we left off. So we were talking last time about how the United States, while we are involved in the war in kind of more of a limited fashion compared to the other countries longevity-wise, that we do have somewhat of an effect toward the last probably 3 to 6 months, especially leading up to the armistice, which is a fancy way of saying ceasefire. So November of 1918, we basically have this big surrender, and everybody's thinking, okay, well, what do we do from here? And the answer is, guys, that's a hard one for us to come to an agreement on because so many countries have a different perspective. Germany is going to be, if you didn't know this, really the last of the Central Powers to formally kind of hang up their weapons or whatever. Okay. And so most of the other countries, Austria, Hungary, other countries like that have already signed separate peace agreements and so forth. And so the question is, guys, if you are going to handle this surrender the best way and try to create what people would call lasting peace, how do you go about doing that? Well, this is going to be a tough challenge. So in January of 1919, okay, you're going to actually have a formal meeting by the name of the Versailles Conference, which is going to produce what's called the Versailles Treaty. This is right outside of Paris in France. You've got a lot of different leaders. I think there were like 29 different countries that were represented. The ones that we'll talk about the most include the major countries that were involved in the conflict more so. Okay. And so Wilson, as the American president, has a role with this. His 14 points, which we're going to read about in class, okay, for those of you that are there, we'll do an activity on if time allows, is really going to emphasize the big picture of what we call, and this is in quotes here, guys, if you want to write it down, peace without victory. I want you all guys to think about what do you think Wilson meant by peace without victory, okay? And remember one thing about the Versailles Conference, Germany was not invited. All right. So pretty much they have no direct input in this treaty. And a lot of students, guys, like to ask a question. They're like, okay, Mr. Baker, after the treaty is said and done, what happens if Germany rejects it? Well, basically, from what I understand, guys, it's probably going back to a state of war. Okay. So if you're Wilson, you don't want to go back to a state of war. You don't also want to have another world war. You got to figure out a way to try to do this in a way that does not completely humiliate the other country, speaking about Germany, but also is going to allow your allies to have a degree of justice. As you can imagine, countries like France and Great Britain especially are not going to agree with Wilson overall. There's a few things that Wilson gets his way with, okay? But a couple of things. Status of Germany following the war was a major topic of debate. What do we mean by status? All right. Something for us to think about is status could be, all right, do we want them to exist in a limited capacity after the war? What does it mean if we say limited? All right. The way I see it is that could be they don't have an army anymore. They don't, have this. They have less territory. They have not many colonies. The list goes on and on. Okay. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at that. And who was really responsible for the First World War? Okay. So at the end of the day, the big three that were there was another one, Vittorio Orlando, that represented Italy, but these are the three that tend to probably get the most attention. You've got Wilson of the United States. That's his picture right there, by the way. You've got David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And you've also got George Clemenceau of France. And so these three personalities, guys, to a large extent, are going to drive a lot of the agenda at Versailles. Okay. And so I want you to think, why would people like Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, to a large extent too, why would they not want to see eye to eye with somebody like Wilson? Okay. And so at the end of the day, a lot of students say, okay, well, Mr. Baker, what are the big things with the treaty? There's a lot of things, but these are the 6 that tend to get the most attention. Okay. A couple of things I want to challenge you guys to think about with this particular slide and the outcome of the war is, first of all, if you're looking at it from Wilson's perspective, guys, how does progressive thinking play into his approach to actually peace? All right, because there is a link there that we'll look at briefly. Okay. The second thing is, guys, is if you were basically going to vote on these 6 things, and by the way, not all of these 6 things actually make their way into the formal treaty. Okay, so they're on the agenda, but they have to be voted on, they have to be decided upon, and ultimately they have to be somewhat agreed upon or at least compromised. Okay, so first of all, the War Guilt Clause, or Clause 231, basically stated Germany was completely responsible for this war. Okay, so that, as you can imagine, is going to be one of the really difficult things. If you're Germany, it's almost like you're swallowing your pride. Okay, we'll talk about whether that made its way into the treaty here in just a moment. Freedom of the seas. This was actually one of Wilson's 14 points. Now, he agrees and believes that there needs to be a commitment to freedom of the seas. Okay, now this might sound like an open and shut case. All right, we can use the oceans however we want. But guys, think about what the problem with the war has been. All right, Wilson is looking at this most likely from an economic perspective first. Okay, if we have freedom of the seas, we can go over we want, we can trade, we can have no restrictions there. Why would a country like France and Great Britain not be in favor? And you guessed it, they're going to be the countries that were, for the most part, guys, more impacted by some of the use of the U-boats, unrestricted submarine warfare, etc. They are not going to be as in favor of this as Wilson will be. Did it make its way into the treaty? We'll talk about that in a moment. Reparations. In other words, countries that did all the damage, Germany, Austria, Hungary, etc., they're going to have to pay back to repair all this war-torn stuff. And guys, let's face the facts. What country was probably the most directly affected by the war? Directly meaning its territory? France. So as you can imagine, France is going to want an awful lot of money. That does make its way into the treaty, but the question is how much? Okay, we'll come back to that. Disarmament. Should Germany be able to enjoy a military of any sort? If they can have a military, how big? What is it going to look like? Should they have an army at all? Should they have a navy? Okay. Guys, a lot of you are thinking, well, Mr. Baker, what are other things this applies to? This could apply, guys, to your ability to actually produce raw materials. Things like oil, things like metals, because after all, you need those things to be able to make a military work. Okay. Fifthly, this was probably the biggest thing, I think it's safe to say, guys, that Wilson is big on, and also a very progressive idea, the League of Nations. What is the League of Nations? This is going to be a group of nations or countries that come together that try to basically maintain peace and security for the world moving forward. Okay. Now, we're going to look at this more in a second, but guys, think about what his intention would be. We need to protect the interests of the world community. All right. And then also the idea of self-determination is a big progressive idea that Wilson believed in. Okay. Being able to give these territories or areas that have been a part of larger empires the ability to have a degree of self-rule. Okay. So if you take a look, guys, at a map, after the war is over, you're going to see like a formal boundary of Poland. You're going to see a formal boundary of Czechoslovakia. Austria and Hungary are going to be broken up. Serbia, Yugoslavia is another place that they're going to actually create, etc. Okay. And so, guys, you're looking at the idea of independence. Now, again, this sounds like an open and shut case, right? All right. These countries, these territories deserve to be able to have a degree of self-rule. But guys, there's a case to be made here about helping countries transition. Okay. Now you can land your plane whether you think it's right or wrong for the United States or other countries to be more involved here. But at the end of the day, guys, the question is, when you're creating these different countries that are a lot of times, in this case, guys, based on cultural boundaries. So, Croatians being in Croatia, Slavs being Slovakia, etc. The way that you create these boundaries, okay, is going to be extremely important. Okay. So what makes its way into the treaty and what doesn't? Guys, believe it or not, over Wilson's objection, the war guilt clause does. Wilson, as you can imagine, sees a major problem with this, but he gets outvoted. Does the first major 14-point freedom of seas make it into it? Guys, what do you think? Are France and Britain going to want to give Germany that much control again of using the oceans? No. This is defeated. It's not made in the treaty. Reparations. Guys, the treaty formally said in American currency that $33 billion, and keep in mind, this is 1919, not 2021, okay, would have to be repaid. Now, to give you an idea how hard that would have been, all right, the amount that Germany would have had to pay with interest as well, they did a study on this years later. Guys, get this, it would have taken until 1984 to actually pay back all of those reparations to all the countries that they owed money for because of their destruction with the war. I was 9 years old in 1984. 65 years. That's a long time. As you can imagine, they're going to have to compromise on the number. Disarmament. That does make its way into the treaty in different ways. Okay. Smaller naval numbers, smaller army, limits on production of resources in Germany, very stringent ones. So guys, they're really making it clear to Germany that, you are not going to be able to have the same status that you had before the war is over with or started, excuse me. Okay. And then the creation of the League of Nations. This does make its way into the treaty. They create a formal charter. Many countries join. The question that we'll look at on our next slide, which is the last major one, does America ever get involved in it? All right, stay tuned for that. And then self-determination. There is going to be, guys, territories, nations, states, whatever you want to use for them, that are in fact going to be formally created out of a lot of these larger empires. Some of them were taken from Russia. And guys, a lot of you are like, well, Mr. Baker, wasn't Russia technically out on the side of the Allies starting the war? Yes. But guys, remember, they gave up a sizable piece of territory to Germany as a result of that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Okay. So they're going to take some parts of Russia, some parts of Austria-Hungary, and also some parts of Germany, and they're actually going to create those smaller states or countries. They also took colonies away from Germany in places like Africa. Okay. So the question is, guys, even though Wilson does not get exactly what he wanted, he has a treaty, right? He brings it back to the United States. And guys, if you didn't know this, a little bit of constitutional history here. If you're going to ratify a treaty formally, it has to be ratified by a certain percentage of the U.S. Senate. Okay. And the deal, guys, is that the president himself can negotiate treaties, but he cannot ratify these. This debate about the role of the president with treaties and the Congress with actually going and ratifying them is as old as not just the Constitution, but even the first administration that succeeded it with the era of George Washington. Okay. We didn't say a lot about that earlier in the year, but it's something to definitely keep in the back of our mind. So guys, put yourself in Wilson's shoes. You're like, okay, here's the treaty. It's not exactly great, but it's basically what we were able to get. Let's ratify it. Let's move on. And guess what happens, guys? The Senate starts to debate, and you've got a divided Senate. Okay. So you've got three different groups or factions. Okay. Now, keep in mind, Wilson, guys, was a Democrat. Okay. So you're going to have some Democrats, probably around a third, give or take, that are going to be somewhat in favor of the treaty, right? They're like, okay, we can accept this, right? It's not perfect, but it does, give us, some reparation support. It does, obviously kind of put Germany in a position of limits That was maybe not the best thing, but nonetheless, so they're okay with it, right? So they're like, all right, we're convinced this treaty can work, okay? But the Republican Party is the wild card here because they do not agree, okay? So you're going to have some Republicans that are very disconcerted or upset with Wilson because evidently, guys, Wilson, when he went over to Versailles in January of 1919, doesn't really bring Republicans with him to negotiate. And I'm not trying to favor party politics here, guys, but at the end of the day, when you know that you're going to have the support of both parties to get a treaty ratified, this does not bode well with actually the process of ratification. So you're going to have two groups of Republicans. The first group are the reservationists. Their concern is the amount of responsibility that the League of Nations is going to require the United States. And also, guys, keep in mind, if the League of Nations has control in a time of war, the concern, guys, if you're these Republicans, is this. Are you taking away the constitutional authority of the Congress to actually declare war? Okay. And I'm not going to tell you what to think and how to think on this, guys, but at the end of the day, a lot of students in the past have asked me, they've said, Mr. Baker, is it a fair concern or just concern? I think, guys, to an extent it is, but hindsight being 2020 is what makes me come to that conclusion a little bit more, because post-World War II, fast forward the clock quite a few years, the League of Nations is basically going to be a dead institution, but the United Nations is pretty much going to take its place. And the U.S. Senate, really, to my knowledge, has not really formally used those war declaration powers the exact same way that the the Constitution allowed up to, even the declaration of war against Japan as a result of Pearl Harbor Day in World War II. Okay. So that's the question, right? You can decide whether, that's good or bad. That's for you all to kind of land your plane on ideologically. Okay. But I do think it could potentially be a fair reservation. Could they have changed their mind had Wilson gone over and got the charter of the League of Nations changed a bit? Yeah, perhaps. Then the third group are the irreconcilables. These are the stubborn, bitter Republicans that don't like Wilson because he didn't include them. Guys, here's my point with this. They could have, talking about Wilson, excuse me, guys, Wilson and the other diplomats could have revised the Versailles Treaty a zillion times, and these irreconcilables are still not going to ratify the treaty. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, they still have to vote. All parties involved. What's the result? The United States Senate never ratified the Versailles Treaty. All right. Now, we eventually, I think in the early 1920s, I want to say this is during the administration of Warren G. Harding, that's the first president after Wilson leaves. Okay. He basically is going to, I think his administration, I believe it was, is going to go through the process of ending the conflict with Germany. All right. The name of the agreement isn't really important to keep in mind. But guys, if you're Wilson, you're trying to get the American public to put pressure on the Senate. So he goes on like a nationwide tour promoting things. He actually had a really severe stroke in the process of trying to get this treaty ratified, to the point where his wife, Edith, I think her name was very, very instrumental with the American presidency. All right. So there's, I would argue that we don't talk a ton about first ladies, some that we do, but I think that she is probably given should be given a lot of credit for how she kind of helped him to stay, somewhat, operating and things like that. At the end of the day, the U.S. Senate does not ratify this treaty. Like I said, this is important. And this is something, guys, worth noting, because the U.S. never ratified the treaty. Ergo, it never joined the League of Nations. Okay. So that's going to be an interesting detail that I think really creates a pretty bad situation moving beyond, okay, this time period. Because in the 1920s, I mean, who really wants another state of war? The 1930s, you see the rise of Hitler and Mussolini before him, and then even Stalin before him. So, guys, you have all these regimes, even imperialist Japan, etc., that are popping up. And the League of Nations, pardon me, guys, really does not have a lot of power and authority to deal with these world issues. Okay. That creates a problem that we'll look at further as we move toward World War II. Okay. At the end of the day, guys, we're at the point where we're transitioning to a period of time that we call the Roaring Twenties. Okay. So I want you to think, just to kind of get you thinking, guys, a little bit. I'll end with this. How would a country try to repair itself somewhat, or at least transition to a time of peace, which is really what the 1920s represents, militarily, politically, culturally, socially, and also even economically? I know that's a lot of themes to think about, but that's really important as we move this next time period into the Roaring Twenties. As always, guys, I appreciate your time. Keep in mind the focus today was the diplomacy of Wilson and how that impacted the process of the treaty. As always, feel free to email me at bakerd@franklinacademy.org with any questions that you have, any suggestions. And as always, stay safe, and I will see you in our next installment as we transition to the Roaring Twenties. Have a good one, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.